I'm Josiah Faylauer, and this video will give you an introduction and brief overview to demand control schema. And this is an oft used theory or schema in interpreting education and practice. Demand control schema, oftentimes abbreviated DCS, is a theory. It can be thought of as a schema, which is why they use the word schema. Schema is like a map. It's like a grid. It's like a way to understand what relates to what and what decisions to make under what circumstances, and it's an interaction of at least two factors. So that's how a schema can be thought of, kind of like a map that you would lay onto a situation to make decisions in a situation. Demand control schema is both descriptive and prescriptive as a theory, meaning it's a theory that describes a reality that we experience, that reality for this theory being a work environment or a work situation, some kind of occupation, in any type of work or occupation. But it is also prescriptive, so it can be used to make decisions, so it can be engaged with and utilized as a decision-making mechanism or tool or framework in how to make decisions. So demand control schema or theory is both descriptive and prescriptive as a theory. So demand control theory was originally developed by a man named Robert Karasek. This was in 1979, and Robert Karasek was studying cardiovascular health. He was doing research, and he chose to look at occupational health as it relates to stress. Stress in the workplace, essentially. So during this research, he developed a framework or a theory that basically stress in the workplace could be understood as being a combination of the demands of a workplace and then the controls of a workplace. I'll describe those more in detail here in a minute, but that was the general framework as to what impacts health of somebody working in any environment. And this, again, was originally researched and developed in 1979 by Robert Karasek. Then in 2001, Robyn, Dean, and Robert Pollard, they basically took this theory and applied it to interpreting. Sign language interpreting specifically, though theoretically it could be applied to spoken language interpreting as well. And for Dean and Pollard, they took the theory and then they thought about the specifics of sign language interpreting. And they developed three main categories as this theory relates to interpreting. It helps to describe and prescribe both overall stress and wellness related to the occupation of interpreting. Also, the effectiveness of interpretation, so the actual interpretation itself, the process of interpreting. And then thirdly, ethical decision making. So all three of these categories, Dean and Pollard developed as things that can be impacted by the demand control theory, originally developed by Robert Karasek in 1979. And all three of these categories are categories that this theory applies to. So now we're going to be mainly focusing on Dean and Pollard's application of demand control schema to interpreting. So we won't be looking at the original theory, we'll be looking at the revised and applied theory. So Dean and Pollard identified demands in four main categories. The demands are the requirements of a job, and for us, the requirements of interpreting. Those four demands that they identified were linguistic demands, environmental demands, interpersonal demands, and intrapersonal demands. And I'll explain each of these in more detail. So linguistic demands could be understood as anything involving language and communication directly. Those would be the linguistic demands. So think about things like the mode of communication between the two parties that are communicating. The linguistic fluency, not only of the interpreter, but also of the speakers, the people communicating, their linguistic fluency. The communication speed and the clarity of communication, the volume of communication, and of course the interpreter's skills involving both receptive and expressive interpreting skills, linguistic skills. So those would be understood as the linguistic demands of an interpreting situation. Secondly would be the environmental demands. This is everything that's happening outside of the interpreter. And so it's out here in the environment. So things like the setting, the sight line to the consumers, between the interpreter and the consumers, any background noise happening in the environment, even the temperature of the room, or if you're interpreting outside, the temperature that it is outside can be a demand. For example, there was an interpreter years ago who wrote an article about interpreting for presidential inauguration in DC, and it was blistering cold. The interpreter had gloves on and a coat and a hat, and it was freezing cold, and that would be an environmental demand of that interpreting situation. But also things like chemicals, odors, seating arrangements, distance between the interpreter and the consumers, lighting, any kinds of visual distractions. Those would be the environmental demands of a setting. And then we have the interpersonal demands. Now, interpersonal demands can be seen as relational demands. So between the interpreter and the consumers, between the interpreter and maybe another interpreter. And so these could be understood as, for example, maybe the role of the interpreter. Not everybody in the setting may understand the role of an interpreter. Maybe people just following norms of behavior, politeness, when to stand, when to sit, movements, interruptions, those kinds of things. Those would be interpersonal demands. And then sometimes communication to the interpreter. This happens often. People involved, or oftentimes the hearing party, the deaf party as well, communicating directly to the interpreter. And a big one, power and authority dynamics. So, who has greater power and authority in a communication setting? A really big impact, and it's definitely an interpersonal demand. Maybe people being dishonest or unfair, turn-taking. So those are all examples of the interpersonal demands in an interpreting situation. And then the final category would be the intrapersonal demands. These are all the things happening inside of the interpreter. Inside the interpreter's head, feelings, emotions, anxieties, fears. Oftentimes the dynamic nature of communication can cause an intrapersonal demand, or the intensity of a communication. Also, there's a term called vicarious trauma, which is the concept of really actually experiencing trauma based on somebody else's trauma. So somebody who's describing a really horrific situation, the interpreter can actually experience that kind of trauma from that being described and having to interact with the language and interpret. That would be understood as vicarious trauma. But of course, just internal doubts, fears, physiological responses to the environment, feeling isolated, feeling a heavy sense of liability in an interpreted situation. So that would be the intrapersonal demands in an interpreted setting. Now, those are just some examples. There are many more in each one of those categories that we could talk through. But that hopefully gives you an idea of the demands. And again, the demands are things that are required of you in your work environment. And so now that now that you hopefully understand demands, let's talk about controls. The controls can be understood as the decision latitude of the person who's engaged in work or services. So for the interpreter, it's what decisions are available to you in that time, in that place. The reason why this is called decision latitude and not just singular decisions is because oftentimes decision opportunities are on a spectrum. Sometimes you have very few decisions you can make and things within or controls that you can use. Sometimes you have more. And so these vary depending on the situation and the environment. And so these could be a number of things, almost an endless number of things. But obviously one control that an interpreter has is self-regulatory types of controls. Being able to do positive self-talk to help assuage nervousness or fear. Other controls would be things like decisions that can be made in the situation, actual behaviors, to move locations, to interrupt the speaker in some scenarios or some situations, to make eye contact with your team interpreter and to seek a feed or support from your team interpreter. Personal character would be a control, and developing a sense of personal character, confidence. Meetings with consumers and different people who are involved in the communication setting, whether that happens before or after the interpreting assignment. And also being able to identify demands at all is a control. So being aware of the demands that are being placed upon you as the interpreter is a control, is one of your controls. And so there are, again, a number of different types of controls that can be applied in a given situation to navigate the demands of that situation. Dean and Pollard, they talk about 3 time frames that demand control schema can be applied. Pre-assignment, so everything happening before the interpretation takes place. Pre-meetings, preparation and practice for the interpreter. Of course, conversations with stakeholders, people involved in the interpreted event. Even sometimes things that help the intrapersonal demands, so meditation, stilling your mind, positive self-talk, those can all happen pre-assignment. And then you have the assignment itself, which is live and everything's moving and happening very quickly. The demand control is happening in real time, often obviously while you are working, so you're having to multitask, not only your work but also going through this list of demands and controls, not necessarily having to consciously identify those, but being aware of them and then reacting to them during the assignment itself. And then the post-assignment would be things like meeting with the consumers after the assignment, reflection, journaling, discussion with a mentor or a peer interpreter. And so Dean and Pollard encourage demand control schema to be applied in each of these time frames. So you who are in interpreting training, demand control schema is something that will come up very often in your interpreting training, most likely. A lot of instructors use demand control schema as a method for teaching, interpreting, and decision making in interpreting. I use it in my classes when I teach skill-based interpreting classes. I use demand control schema as a way to talk about interpreting work and making decisions, and very important in terms of ethical decision making. Oftentimes in interpreting training, student interpreters or emerging interpreters will do situational analysis or simulations of situations where they can apply demand control schema to a hypothetical situation. And then assessing how that demand control schema not only would be applied, but then also predicting the consequences of applying demand control schema to a given situation. So again, with interpreting, it's a very complex process. There's a lot of things happening at the same time, not only with the act of interpreting itself, but also managing all of those demands internally, interpersonally, environmentally, linguistically, all of these demands all happening simultaneously. And being able to have the tools to and have the controls to manage those demands will make all of the difference, not only in interpreting quality, but also just the interpreter's well-being and their ability to manage and self-care, and also to be ethical. So demand control schema is, again, a very important theory and schema to be aware of and apply to interpreting training and work. Again, this has been an introduction and brief overview of Dean and Pollard's demand control schema. I hope it was helpful in just starting to build your understanding of this theory and why it is that we use it in interpreting. This is Josiah Faylauer. I'll see you next time.